Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Living Under Nazi Rule review and recap series. We're carrying on with theme 3, which is all about how the lives of ordinary people in Germany changed between 1933 and 1939 as a result of Nazi policies. In the last video, we looked at how the lives of women were impacted by Nazi policies. In this video, we are looking at how the lives of workers were impacted by Nazi policies. I should start off by saying that the workers were the largest group that we're going to look at, and they are also the most important in the eyes of the Nazis because they are the key to all production in Germany, which of course is something that is very important to the Nazis, considering that they have one eye on preparation for war. So they are going to try and do different things to different groups of workers to try and help them in some particular way. The first group of workers that we're going to have a look at are small craftsmen, so those who own small to medium-sized businesses. And in 1933, the Nazis passed the law to protect retail trade. And the idea behind this is that they are going to increase the taxes placed on larger stores to try and protect those smaller businesses. In German, the word is known as Mittelstand, which means small business owner or medium-sized business owner, and it's to try and protect them from the larger business corporations in Germany at the time. Unfortunately for the Mittelstand, this has very little impact as the number of artisans, so small businessmen, small craftsmen, actually drops between 1936 and 1939 by 100,000. So that is quite a significant reduction. So therefore this policy and this law was actually a failure. The next group of workers that the Nazis tried to help in some way or impact were the peasants, so the farmers. In 1933 as well, they passed something called the Reich entailed farm law, and the idea behind this was to try and force farm owners to pass any land on when they die or when they retire to the eldest son rather than dividing the land up between lots of children or selling it onto large-scale farm enterprises. Because the Nazis were worried that farmers were leaving the business and lots were kind of splitting up into smaller and smaller farms or selling it to large businesses. The peasants in the eyes of the Nazis are quite important because, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Nazis want autarky, which means that they are self-reliant. They don't have to import food from any other country, which is especially useful in times of war. But again, the Nazi policy doesn't work. It's not effective. There's two real reasons for this. The first is that because the peasants are tied to the land, it means that there is no innovation. There's no sort of changing techniques, which means that the farm produce isn't actually that good. And the second reason is that the number of peasants actually continues to drop anyway. It drops from about 21% to 18% by 1939. Okay, so the peasant population actually declines. The next group that the Nazis tried to influence were probably the most important subsection within the worker section as a whole, and that's industrial workers. The reason that they're so important is because it's roughly about 46% of the working population. Again, they're very important to the preparation for war when it comes to armaments and things like that. So the Nazis tried to incentivize working in factories. And in 1936, they increased the average wage for an industrial worker up to 35 marks a week. This is 10 times more money than you would receive if you were on the dole in Germany at the time. So it's trying to incentivize people to join the factory and work there rather than relying on the German government for money. However, whilst 35 marks a week was quite good, that was a very high salary for people at the time, for the average worker, you have to look at it in comparison to what living costs were like in Germany. Wages were actually frozen in 1933 at this level, but inflation, so the cost of living, continues to rise. So yes, they're on 35 marks a week, but the cost of food, the cost of bills, the cost of housing actually continues to increase, which means that their money isn't actually worth as much. So that's one way in which the policy towards the workers was actually a failure. Another reason that the Nazis weren't that effective at improving the lives of workers is the fact that they set up something called the Winter Relief Fund. Now, the Winter Relief Fund is soup stations across Germany that are there to try and help the worst off in society. So to provide the worst off with the least amount of money, potentially homeless as well, with a hot meal. Now, on the one hand, that's positive because it's looking out for those who are worst off in German society. But It's actually a negative thing for the workers because these Winter Relief Fund soup stations were funded by taking 3% of the wages of workers. And this was forcibly done by the SA. Okay, so they used intimidation to take this money as well. So you have to factor in the fact that already wages are frozen, inflation is rising, and now on top of this, they're having to give 3% of their wage to fund these soup kitchens. So it caused lots of resentment from the industrial class in Germany. The next thing that we need to look at when we're looking at the lives of workers is something called the Deutsche Arbeitsfront. Now, we've already talked about the fact that in, I think it's May 1933, trade unions are outlawed. It's illegal to be a part of a trade union. They're banned. And trade union leaders are arrested. That's because the Nazis fear the power of trade unions and fear that they could encourage their workers to go on strike if they disagree with Nazi policy. So the Nazis get rid of this, but they realise that they need an alternative to keep workers happy. So they set up the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, which stands for the German Labour Front, and it's shortened to DAF. Membership in this was pretty much compulsory by the fact that in 1939, 29 million members had joined up. You had to pay to join, and it was led by a man called Robert Ley. If you didn't join, you would probably struggle to get an industrial job anywhere. So yes, it was technically voluntary, but it was compulsory by the fact that if you didn't join, you would struggle to get work. Now, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the DAF, set up a series of initiatives to try and help improve the lives of workers. The first of these initiatives in these branches was something called Strength Through Joy. And this was a policy aimed at organising and improving workers' leisure time. So the Nazi Party would pay for things like subsidised holiday tickets. They paid for theatres and gyms. And this was hugely popular with the working class. In 1937, 1.7 million workers went on package tours, package holidays around Germany. Again, shows the popularity of this. So this was considered quite a positive and a beneficial change that the Nazis brought in for the lives of workers. The second branch of the DAF was called Beauty of Labour, and this aimed to improve the workplace by building new facilities, such as toilets, showers, and other sort of amenities within the work environment, so changing rooms, things like that. This aimed to improve morale at the workplace, make them more likely to want to go to work because they were working in nicer conditions, and therefore that incentivizes working more and working harder. Again, this was considered often a positive change to workers. The third branch of the DAF was called the Reich Labour Service. Now, this was set up to try and tackle mass unemployment. In 1933, so at the sort of peak of the Great Depression in Germany, or just after the peak of the Great Depression and after the Treaty of Versailles in the 1920s, unemployment is rife in Germany. There are 6 million people unemployed. So the Reich Labour Service states that all men between the ages of 18 to 25 had to serve 6 months doing some sort of manual labour. So they worked on big state projects like building motorways called the Autobahns. They built railways, bridges, and all of this was done in a very militarized fashion. So they would be arranged in columns when they were marching to wherever they needed to work. They would carry their shovels like a rifle resting on their shoulder. So it was a very militarized form of work. Yes, it's helping rebuild Germany. Yes, it's also providing some sort of employment for those who didn't have a job, but it's also preparing them on an implicit level for life in the military. There was another scheme run by the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, which was called the Volkswagen Scheme. This was where workers could pay 5 marks a week into a fund, and eventually they would earn a Volkswagen car. However, the problems with this were that there was no time frame given, so it wasn't said how long they would need to pay this 5 marks a week for, and there was no actual ever promise of a date by the time they would receive their car. So this means that by the time World War II breaks out in September 1939, production of the Volkswagen cars is stopped as the production has to focus on war efforts instead. So all of the workers who had invested in this scheme lose their money and they don't actually get any of it back. Okay. So this is a hugely unsuccessful and ineffective way of trying to improve the lives of workers. the same as ever then, I've come up with a series of 5 questions for you to test yourself on based on the lives of workers. I'm going to flash those up on the screen now. What I would like you to do is pause the video and test yourself on these. These are by no means everything that you need to know for the lives of workers, but this is just a good starting place for your revision. Okay, so pause the video now, please. See what you can remember and then mark what you get out of 5 at the end. Thank you for watching this one. The next video is going to be on the changing lives of the Jewish population in Germany at the time.